you've read a little bit about what they both think about these things. Now, again, Hamilton wants and supports all of this. Of course, Jefferson doesn't want any of it. And we saw some of the reasons why he didn't like assumption, why he doesn't like tariffs, why he doesn't like excise taxes. But the one that caused the biggest debate, because it involved an issue of legality, was that national bank, as we saw. So Jefferson and the national bank. What did Jefferson say about that national bank? It's what? Shouldn't be there. Why? It is unconstitutional. Okay, it is unconstitutional. Jefferson is arguing that it is downright unconstitutional for Congress to create that national bank. Now, Jefferson doesn't like the idea of the bank to begin with. A lot of people didn't. There were a lot of folks that saw banks as corrupt, that just honestly did not understand banking, and that saw banks as kind of like gambling, and saw banks kind of as the enemy. But Jefferson even is arguing here that it's downright illegal, that Congress doesn't have the authority to create it to begin with. What was his reasoning as to why Congress did not have the authority to create this national bank? Exactly. He says it's not an enumerated power. It's not an enumerated power. It's not listed as one of their jobs in the Constitution. It says they can tax. It says they can declare war, blah, blah, blah. But it does not say Congress has the authority to create a national bank. And so he therefore argues that if it does not say it, then you cannot do it. And it would be illegal, and Congress would be exceeding their power if they chose to create a national bank. Now, we know that Hamilton, of course, wants the bank for a number of financial reasons. But what did he say? What was his answer to Jefferson saying that this was unconstitutional? Yes. Oh. Okay.
Just because it's not listed in the Constitution doesn't mean you do it, because it could essentially help the nation.
Yeah, so he says, if it's not, as long as it wasn't what? What did he say about that? Yeah. As long as it wasn't denied. He says, as long as it's not denied, we can do it. That it's related to some of those other things. It will help us do some of those other things that the Constitution did provide for, that the Constitution did mention. And as long as it's not prohibited, as long as it's not, doesn't explicitly say you can't create a national bank, then it is all right. So what Hamilton is arguing here is that the Constitution has wiggle room to it, that it's flexible. And, just because it doesn't say it doesn't mean you can't do it. What Hamilton is ultimately arguing for here is he is suggesting that there is something called implied powers. Now, we talked about enumerated powers, we talked about concurrent powers, all of those things. But what Hamilton is saying is that there's also something called implied powers. What does it mean if you imply something?
You don't outright say it, but you give clues about it.
Yeah, you don't outright say it, but you give clues about it. It's kind of, in between the lines sort of a thing. Hamilton is arguing that there is a whole wealth of stuff that is implied, that the Constitution didn't directly say Congress could do this, but it was suggested. And what part of the Constitution do you think he bases this off of? What part do you think he says implies this? That one actually more talks about rights, but it is where things are implied. Yes, elastic clause, exactly. That this implied powers, they have their basis in the elastic clause. Because once again, that elastic clause said that Congress can also do what? Anything it needs to do to get the job done, if you want to interpret it that way, that they can do what's necessary and proper to carry out those enumerated powers, that it stretches the power of Congress. And we mentioned even then that, there's going to be immediate debate over exactly what that means. And Hamilton is basically arguing that that means Congress can pretty much do whatever they want to do, as long as they don't go into the denied stuff. Jefferson obviously is going to disagree with that.
Teachers, please pardon this interruption for a quick announcement. Students, this is just a reminder, if you are in Coach Eason's third period class, you will report to room 203A. Again, his third period class should report to room 203A. If you are in his fourth period class, you should report to room 213A. And that's again with Coach Eason's classes. Thank you.
Okay. So Jefferson obviously thinks that it doesn't do much at all, but he said that elastic clause creates these implied powers, things that were suggested by that. And it's not good for Congress to be totally have their hands bound and only be able to respond to those things that were specifically mentioned, that they need to have some flexibility so they can respond to stuff as it comes up that perhaps maybe the framers did not think of. So he's saying there are implied powers. The national bank would be one. Now that's going to continue to be an argument for a long time. So Hamilton's going to, argue that for a long time. We will not hear the Supreme Court weigh in on that for quite a while. So that's still going to be quite the disagreement. Now, just so you know, all of this eventually does go through. That eventually the financial plan, all of it does get passed. Congress does approve all of it eventually. The national bank is created. The tariffs go through. The excise tax goes through, an assumption. And it's actually quite effective. They're able to raise their funds to pay off the debt relatively quickly. It really is quite remarkable how fast it does restore public credit and all those things. But that doesn't mean that Jefferson, of course, goes, oh, I guess you were right. He's still pretty upset about the whole thing. Now, what this has basically shown us is, we've seen Hamilton and Jefferson disagree on these specific issues, disagree about the bank, the tariffs, all that sort of stuff. But what's also happening here, what's even deeper going on here, is a fundamental disagreement about the very nature of the Constitution itself, about the very nature of, how it ought to be interpreted, okay? And you've already seen these two different ways of looking at things in action. So, it'd be pretty easy to understand what this means. So one way of looking at the Constitution that we've seen in this whole debacle is a interpretation called strict construction. Strict construction, or a strict constructionist, views the Constitution very strictly. They view the Constitution as being very narrow. It is narrow, it is concrete, it is exact. The Constitution says what it says, and it doesn't say anything else. It means what it says, it's literal. Which of these two was the strict constructionist in this situation? Jefferson. So Jefferson's argument that if it's not in there, you can't do it, that is strict construction. And at this point in time, Jefferson is a major strict constructionist. He loosens up a little bit as he goes along. But he is, looking at the Constitution extremely narrowly and saying that it was meant to be taken word for word. You got to limit the government to just those things that it said. The other way is loose construction. Loose construction, or a loose constructionist, is someone that views the Constitution with a lot more flexibility, that sees the Constitution as flexible, that sees it as, it's got wiggle room, it's got gray areas, that it can be kind of stretched or interpreted differently, that just because it doesn't say something doesn't necessarily mean you can't do it, and that the government, Congress, or whoever, is not meant to be just totally bound to exactly what it says word for word. Which of these two is the loose constructionist? Certainly Hamilton. His argument for implied powers, that just because it's not there doesn't mean we can't, all of that is a loose construction argument. And obviously this is a spectrum. It's not like you're one or the other. Some, there's degrees of it. Now Hamilton is probably more of a loose constructionist than most, going as far as to say as long as it isn't denied, then it's all right. Don't even necessarily have to be connected to one of those enumerated powers. But these are very, very different political philosophies here about how to interpret all of this. So these differences between Hamilton and Jefferson, like I said, they will eventually erupt into the first political parties in this country. Now that doesn't happen immediately because Washington tends to side with Hamilton almost all the time. And political parties are a very interesting topic. They go and they change. But it starts to happen in the Washington administration as you have Hamilton's kind of way of viewing things and people that agree with him, and then Jefferson's way of viewing things and people that agree with him. So it's not just the two of them, they just kind of become the face and the voice for either sort of side of this debate. And then by the time Washington leaves office, you pretty much have two major political parties that have taken on names and have kind of an identity and that are running their own candidates for office. So the first of those call themselves Republicans. Now, before we look any further, please realize that these are not the modern day, this is not the modern day Republican Party. Neither of these two. I always get asked which one's the Republicans, which are the Democrats. The answer is neither. We live in a different world, and so there are some commonalities that these Republicans would have with today's. There are some that they would not. So it just isn't like that. It's not like one is the early version of the other. Just same name. These are the Jeffersonian Republicans. So the Republicans, this is Jefferson's side. So this is Jefferson's side of the argument, and people that think like Jefferson, that agree with him, and that would have supported his point of view. What do you think these Republicans think about the national government? Should it be strong or should it be weaker? Yeah, very limited, yeah. They want a national government or a federal government that's much more limited, that is much weaker. Where would they want more of the power to be? Where do they want the power to be? Yes. With the states and the people. States and the people. Remember all that stuff Jefferson was saying about the people, the people, the people? That's the mantra of the Republican Party. And again, Jefferson kept arguing that those were the people that made a republic great. Those were the people that were essential to a true republic functioning, thus the name Republican. Okay, they're saying that they are the true guardians, the true believers, and what makes a true Republican government great. That it is run by the people, the small farmers, the average folks, all of that. They're definitely in favor of strict construction for that reason. You know, more power to the state level, the local level, and all of that. Okay, so we will stop there for today. We'll look at the other one. We'll start there, finish this up, and then look at Washington's foreign policy as well.